Hey folks, this is Shane with the Soil Ministry. In this video, I want to talk about and demonstrate what to do if your hot compost pile isn't getting hot enough or if it isn't staying hot enough long enough. And both of those are very common hot compost pitfalls. So last week, I built a hot compost pile in the garden and, well, I had a compost failure. Now it's been a while since I had a pile not get hot enough, but this was the first time it didn't stay hot enough long enough. So you see, the ideal temperature range for a hot compost pile is between 131 and 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Below 131, there isn't sufficient heat to kill off the human and plant pathogens. And above 170 degrees, the pile's going to turn anaerobic, and the bacteria that are operating at those really high temperatures, they're going to produce undesirable compounds like ethanol and hydrogen sulfide. Now my failed pile, I initially got it up to 148 degrees after 24 hours, which is awesome. It even peaked at 168 degrees. After I turned it, it came up to 148 degrees after 16 hours, and this is awesome. But then it didn't hold its temperature. It dropped out of composting range, and it dropped down to 128 degrees after 48 hours, and at this point, it's a dud. But I flipped it one more time just to see if it would heat back up, and it did, but it only got up to 115 degrees. So this is not enough heat to kill off any human or plant pathogens or the weed seeds. So needless to say, this was a huge disappointment, because after all that time and work collecting all the inputs and mixing this massive amount of organic material and even reaching that high temperature of 168 degrees, my pile just wasn't a success. Well, not yet anyway. Luckily, not all hope is lost. I can still turn this super common compost failure into a compost success, and you can too. So if your pile isn't getting hot enough or it isn't staying hot enough long enough, the pile will need to be rebuilt reusing all of your old starting materials, and you'll treat all of that as your brown carbon source. You'll need to reintroduce fresh nitrogen-rich and high nitrogen-rich material into the pile and do that at a higher rate than you originally did because it didn't work the first time. So in the case of the pile not getting hot enough, which is above 131 degrees Fahrenheit, that's a sign that you didn't have enough high nitrogen material. There's just not enough high nitrogen material to get that party started in the pile. So in my case, where the temperature didn't hold in the high temperature range long enough, that's a sign that I didn't have enough green material, my nitrogen source. So those greens are what maintain the heat after the high nitrogen material kicks it into gear. All right, so let's head out to the garden, and I'm going to demonstrate how to breathe some new life back into this pile. Okay, so here we are in the community garden, and I've got behind me this amazing pile of almost composted organic material. It started off with a bang. I got up to 168 degrees right away. I flipped it. It got up to 148 degrees the second time, and then it crashed. It didn't hold that high temperature long enough to kill off the plant and human pathogens as well as the weed seeds. So that's a pretty good indicator that I was lacking in my green material. Green material is going to sustain the high temperature once the high nitrogen party foods bring it up. Well, luckily, I already have all this green material and high nitrogen manure alfalfa mix here in the garden. So what I'm going to do is reincorporate these nitrogen and nitrogen rich materials into this old compost pile. I'm going to see if I can't heat this thing back up. And as usual, it's a lot of material to work with at once, so I'm going to break it in half. I'll take half of this old pile and put it on the tarp. I'll mix half of this new green material in with it, and I'll feed that into the new cage. Then I'll repeat the process. I've soaked these materials overnight, and I did that by filling these bins about halfway full of water and dumping out the excess. Remember, I still need to make sure this pile is at around a 50% moisture level, so keep your hose handy if you need to wet any of your materials any further. I'm going to add 3 bins of greens and 3 bins of high nitrogen manure alfalfa mix, and 1 more bin of leaves that I have laying around. And that should give me an overall ratio of 60% browns, 20% greens, and 20% high nitrogen. Whereas before I was closer to 70% browns, 15% greens, and 15% high nitrogen. This is why keeping a log for each of your piles is important. It's good data and information to look back on, and you can adjust your amounts as you fine-tune your compost recipes. especially as the seasons and temperatures change. Okay, great. I'm all finished, and just as always, I'm going to place the thermometer into the center of the pile and monitor the temperature over the next few days. Let's hope the second tries the charm. And there you have it. If your first pile doesn't heat up or doesn't stay hot enough long enough, you can always add more greens and more high nitrogen material to your pile. Good luck and happy composting.